about overall financial wellness. So, um, so this is, this is an overview. We're not going to do a real granular look at things, but um, when this program was put together, these are some of the questions to consider. Do you have money? Do you wish you had more money? With you and your significant other, do you ever argue about money? Do you ever have sleepless nights or feel sick about money, feel guilty about money? Um, in my prior life, when I wore a different hat before I was a therapist, I actually did work as a financial planner. So, my mental health and financial health, they're all connected, right? It's one of the pillars of overall health. So, when things are chaotic in our financial life, it does take a toll on us emotionally. All right. So, obviously to manage money, the old saying, you have to pay down your debt, increase your savings, invest for your future. It's not as simple as that, right? If it were that easy, we'd all have plenty of money in retirement and be debt free and all of that, right? Um, my opinion is that, wages in general for most people haven't kept up with inflation, so it does become harder to accomplish financial objectives. So there's also other variables besides just dollars and cents, right? Emotions really tie into managing our finances. So things like fear, hopelessness. Sure, there's a lack of knowledge for some people. A big one is lack of self-discipline. We may have a significant other who has very different money styles from our own. Maybe one of you is a saver and the other is a spender, right? Or, one just kind of wings it and the other has a budget and balances the checkbook, right? So there's a lot of reasons, but also a lot of our decisions when it comes to money are not always based on logic, but rather based on emotion. So I'm going to give you a few strategies to kind of help deal with some of this. So that old adage, right? Can money buy happiness? Well, money is not everything. So, obviously if you're in poor health or something like that, all the money in the world doesn't really make you feel better. But money does buy you options, right? So money does reduce a lot of intense stress, right? When you can't make your bills, when you're worried about running out of money every month, that is a stressful position to be in. Having some money does give you some control, right? So some people, for example, may be stuck in a job that they want to make a change, but they don't because they need, the salary and they can't, their desired profession doesn't pay enough, something like that, right? So money doesn't in and of itself create happiness, but it certainly reduces the stress and gives you a lot more options in life. So it leads to higher life satisfaction. So in thinking about financial wellness, right, it's always a good idea to have an emergency fund set aside that is 3 to 6 months of your expenses. So not just 3 to 6 months of your salary, but rather the things that you're going to be paying every month, like your living expenses, your groceries, your utilities, right? Car, your car payment, insurance, all of those things, right? A safe rule of thumb is 3 to 6 months. Um, so the difference in this scenario of someone getting a flat tire when you have resources financially versus not, right? Okay, so I'm driving to work, I get a flat tire. Some of you may be able to change the tire yourself, but let's say for a moment that you know, it's a case where maybe you have two flats and you don't, the spare is not going to work. So it's an inconvenience, right? It's unfortunate, it's a time delay, but you can easily have a tire replaced, right? But for someone that doesn't have the financial means, it leads to a whole nother layer of stress, right? Having to think about, oh gosh, if I have to tow the car, how much is that going to cost? And I'm going to have to put this on my credit card or maybe I got to borrow money from, a parent or, somebody. So, it's not that life doesn't throw us curveballs that are stressful, but it's a whole lot more stressful when you don't have the financial resources to handle things like that. So there's a lot of things in life that we don't have control over, right? We don't always have control over things like, something breaks down in the home, so home repairs or your car or you know, uh, you know, someone gets sick in the family and there's medical bills, right? Even things like job loss, right? Sometimes companies downsize or are cutting expenses, and sometimes people lose their jobs, and it's not based upon their performance, right? Um, so having some money set aside for these situations is important, right? Because we don't know what the future is going to hold per se, but you can most times in life, we're going to be thrown some curveballs where we're going to need access to some liquid funds. So, um, if you're just dealing with the matter at hand, that's one thing. But if you're worried about, geez, I've got these medical bills and I'm in a high deductible healthcare plan and I have to pay out of pocket, 10 or 15,000 before my insurance even kicks in. That's very stressful for people, if they don't have that money set aside to come up with. So this session is about helping you see money management as part of a healthy lifestyle, right? It's kind of one of those pillars of overall health. We'll share some strategies to build a foundation for financial wellness, exploring ways to navigate challenges and how to make ends meet, and share resources to find information and support you in these goals. So this isn't about a quick fix or giving you stock picks or telling you how to invest your money, right? Um, Many of you probably have money in the market through your 403(b) or 401(k), and I think it's always a great idea to meet with an advisor to just kind of take a look at your asset allocation and how much risk you're taking on based on your age and years to retirement. That's always a good rule of thumb. Um, Particularly now, the market is extremely volatile. And so a lot of people, what happens is when the market starts to drop, people get scared, right? And then there's sell-offs. So that creates a lot of volatility. But really thinking about what are my goals and my objectives and having the long term in mind, as long as you're not getting close to retirement. So this is not the only resource for you, for financial wellness, obviously. I'm going to share some of those resources, but this is not going to be, the end all be all or anything like that. Um, So think of financial wellness as one of the pillars of overall health. There's physical health, there's emotional health, there's relationship, there's spiritual, right? I think financial really can make an impact on all those other areas. So it's also not a one and done, right? So, you may be good about creating a budget and things like that. But it does require some follow through, right? Like maybe expenses come up that are unexpected. So like tweaking things and looking at things and perhaps going back to the drawing board if you need to kind of recalculate things. And that goes with your investments for retirement too, right? Looking at all this stuff. So, self-discipline is a big part of successful money management. Many of us may be very disciplined in other dimensions of our life, right? Maybe at work and things like that. But when it comes to finances, people sometimes are not the most disciplined. So, um, you've probably heard about books like, The Millionaire Next Door and things like that, right? These are people that, in a nutshell, a cliff note of the book, these are people that were of somewhat average means, that became wealthy over time, by saving and investing and not living beyond their means, right? They didn't care about the flashy new car, you know. They drove a, like, I don't know, 10-year-old Honda or something, right? So, they really kind of, had that self-disciplined. So where to start? So I wanted to talk about this formula. Now, this is not the be all end all, ratio, but for most people, it's a good rule of thumb to focus 50% of your income on, um, the things that you need. So that's like your housing, your transportation, your medical insurance, your life insurance, all, the things that you need, right? And then 30% of your income going to wants. So this is where things like travel, right? Your hobbies, um, beyond the bare necessities, things, that you like, they need, but these are our wants. And then 20% of your overall income going towards savings. Um, So savings is also, included in that is paying down any debt beyond the minimum payments due. So if you have a loan or a credit card, part of that, that say that this is the average 50, 30, 20. But as we get closer to retirement age, I would argue that it makes sense to increase, that 20% figure. So, maybe it's 25% or 30% the closer you get to retirement. Typically, what happens is when we're younger and we're starting out, we have no net worth or negative net worth, right? Coming out of college, you got the student loan debt, you don't own a home yet. You really have basically negative net worth. And then as we start to work and put money in retirement, right, start to pay off those loans, um, start to, maybe outside of our 401k, maybe we're investing in a Roth or things like that. Over time, typically the pattern is that, we increase our net worth with our age, right? It gets better. That's not the case for everybody, right? Not everybody is diligent about saving and investing. Some people acquire more debt as they get older. So, but this 50, 30, 20 is kind of a good rule of thumb for needs and wants. This other slide is, it's probably hard to read. It's a little bit small, but I want you to think about money in terms of values. So this helps give people their why. Because if we just say, yeah, you just need to, set aside this amount of money and this and that, sometimes we don't, with our heart, always buy into that unless we know our whys. What's our real reason for saving money, right? And this financial values inventory, the idea behind this is there are several things that are listed in pairs as to decide what's most important to you, right? So housing versus retirement. I want them both, right? But is it more important to you to have a healthy retirement or your dream home right now, right? Education versus vacation. Is it more important for you to invest in the education of yourself? And that's not just college. That's, that can be, courses in your field that, help you with growing in your career. It can be the education of your children in college. Is that more important to you, or is travel more important, right? So these things are listed in pairs. And basically, kind of the rule of thumb is like, don't worry about what anyone else thinks. This is something for you to think about. And as you look at these categories, circle which one is most important. And what you'll see is kind of a theme, right? There's some of the same things are listed over and over again. And if you're picking that, that means that's really important to you, right? So you can see hobbies, sports versus going to church and charitable giving, or um, let's see, what's another one? Housing versus vacation, right? Like we can't have everything at the same time, right? Sometimes there's give and take. So, maybe I'm not living in a, six, $700,000 home, even if I can afford the mortgage, because I want some of my discretionary income to go into that retirement or that savings, right? So there are decisions throughout life that we need to make, right? I know some people go into the bank and they tell you, oh yeah, you qualify for, half a million or $750,000 mortgage. That may very well be true based on your income, but that doesn't always mean that makes the most sense for you, right? For some people, then they become house poor and they're not able to spend money on things that they really value. Your hobby might be really important to you. Traveling with your family while your kids are young and you're creating these lifelong memories, right? That might be really important to you. Your faith and contributing, you know, um, to your church, that might be really important to you. So kind of looking at these things, and looking at um, living your life in terms of your values with money, right? So where I value things is where I put my money. We don't always do that, right? A lot of times we spend our money on things that at the end of the day we don't really value. You know, we buy things impulsively. We shop on Amazon or Temu, or we're buying things just kind of not, oh, the shiny object, right? Oh, this looks cool. I'm going to get this. But a good rule of thumb is really to think about things in terms of what is it that you value in life, and your money can be used in that way too, right? Spending the money in the areas that matter to you. And this is unique to everybody, right? I spend a lot of money on travel, right? I'm a scuba diver. I travel to other countries to dive. And so it's a very expensive hobby, right? Some people are like, how can you do that? Well, that's adventure and travel and, um, meeting people from different cultures and different countries. That's really important to me. So for many people, that wouldn't be. That would be oh no, that's way too expensive of a hobby. I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to spend more money on my home or things like that. So really think about your personal values when it comes to all this. All right. Another thing is to think about how you relate to money in and of itself. Based on the way we were raised, when our parents started to maybe talk to us about money or never talk to us about money, does kind of set some of our values about money. So some people, are very frugal and they learned, how to save at a young age, and they're great about that. But think about these words when it comes to money. How do you feel about the word debt or being economically disadvantaged? What is your risk tolerance, when it comes to investing? Are you very conservative where you want things that are FDIC insured and in savings or CDs, or are you okay with investing in the market that fluctuates, right? But think about these words, possessions, right? What does that mean to you? To have a lot of things, is that important? How about envy? Sometimes when we get into really, really nice communities, really nice suburbs, there is this kind of idea of like keeping up with the Joneses, right? My neighbor's got the Beamer, so, I should probably have a really nice car too, you know. Um, so what I'm encouraging you to do with some of these words is think about money in terms of what you value, right? And sometimes there may be things underneath the way you handle money that have to do with these maybe difficult ideas you have about money, right? So our frugal people, yeah, they have a lot in savings, but they may have a poverty mentality where despite how much money they have in the bank, there's never going to be enough because they're worried about what ifs, right? What if this happens? What if that happens? Right? Some people, are risk averse. Some people are, um, take on a lot of debt because they figure, oh, I'll pay it off eventually. It'll be okay. So I'm trying to get you to kind of think about some of the things that are important to you and what you value and how that can tie into how you manage your money. So a good rule of thumb is to track your spending. Um, many people aren't using pen and paper anymore. There's so many different apps. I mean, NerdWallet has apps. Um, some people keep an Excel spreadsheet. There's a ton of free apps out there, but it helps to kind of, rather than try to make changes right away, it's a good idea to like track your expenses for 30 to 60 days. Just see where all your money's going, right? You might be surprised. Might be surprised about some of the things you're spending money on that is not in line with your values, and it eats up quite a bit of money. So some of those impulse purchases on Amazon or whatever, right? eBay or who knows what, right? Um, so pay attention to where your money's going, right? How about that morning coffee run? Um, I remember back in the day, there was an author by the name of Richard Bach, and he wrote a book about the latte factor. I'm aging myself here because this was like in the early 2000s, but it was all about like, getting that expensive coffee drink or whatever that thing is. For some people, it was, something else that they spent money on, that they did routinely. And I'm a coffee person, so maybe it's the Starbucks or Caribou or whatever. That $5 fancy coffee every day, adds up. So kind of looking at this stuff and looking at it like after no changes are made, right? Just kind of tracking how you're spending your money for a good 30 days. And it can be eye-opening. You may have a lot of subscriptions to things that you don't even realize or think about, that type of thing. And then once you've tracked those expenses, you can start to set some goals based on what you're seeing. Maybe your goal is to buy a home, or you need another car, or you're putting your kids through college, or you owe money, right? You have debts, or you've borrowed money from an in-law or parent, and it's your goal to pay them back. Or you want to create that 3 to 6 month emergency fund. So think about what are your goals, right? And sometimes, we have multiple competing goals, right? Like many people are saving for retirement, and they're also funding a child's education, right? They're saving in a 529 plan. So there's usually different buckets of money for these goals. Once you know what your goals are and you know what your values are, and you want to, live financially within your values, then creating a budget. So the budget is, your inflows and your outflows, your assets, your liabilities, right? So how much money do you make and how much money do you spend? And there's some great, like I said, there's some great tools out there for creating a budget. It's not really the creating the budget part, and the numbers is not the hard part. The hard part is the emotions that are tied into some of these decisions. Here's some of those budgeting resources. There's Financial Literacy 101. You guys have probably heard of Dave Ramsey, I think he has a book called The Total Money Makeover. How to create a family budget. So a lot of his tools are free. You don't have to go out and subscribe to his whole program to get some of these tools. There's many different budget templates. I think NerdWallet is kind of a nice free site that has a lot of good tools as well. So yeah, take a look at some of these tools when you're working on your own family budget. And then, I won't go too deep into this, but it's all your inflows and your outflows, right? For most of us, a big part of that would be, our income from our employment, right? But some people have other things, right? You might have a side hustle, or you might own a rental property or, other things. So taking all those things into account. So many people leverage debt, right? I mean, when we buy a house, we're leveraging debt, right? When we buy a car, those types of things. Um, but a lot of times people have, gotten into the habit of acquiring quite a bit of unsecured debt on a credit card. So that's the most expensive debt, right? The highest interest rate debt. So when that is the case, right, you kind of got to think about the big picture. So if you're in like a retirement plan at work, which most of us are, right, I would say if they're matching you in the retirement plan, put the money into the match because that's 100% return on your money, right? If they match you 3 or 5%, it's kind of silly to walk away from that type of money, right? Because that will help you in your later years. But outside of that free money match, you want to pay off debt first, right? Because that can just linger and linger. So there's two different methods. One is the snowball method. And I think Dave Ramsey talks about this, which is paying down your smallest debts as quickly as possible. And then when that smallest debt frees up, then the next debt, right? So you're making all your minimum payments, but you're paying off your small stuff first and then rolling in that last payment into the new smaller debt, kind of like that. So it's like snowballing. And then the other approach is the avalanche method, which is paying down your highest interest debts first. Um, so the advantage of the snowball method is that psychologically, you're going to see things paid off more quickly. And when we say snowball, it's like, oh, when you start to feel the effects of how good it feels to pay something off, and that mo money is now going towards the net debt, some next debt, it's like in a snowball effect, right? Whereas the avalanche, you may not see the debt coming down as quickly because you are tackling your highest interest rate debt. Um, so if you can forego the psychological wins of seeing debt paid down more quickly, paying down your highest interest debt is actually probably the smartest of the two methods, right? Because that means that higher interest rate debt is going first. Because the longer you hold on to that, the more you pay in interest. Now, um, if your credit is good, some people, and I've done this myself in the past, they run up a balance on a card and then they transfer that to a zero interest card. If you're disciplined, that can be a good strategy, especially if they have, 18 to 22 months of zero interest. But what happens to a lot of people is they depend on that. They transfer their balance and they keep the same financial habits of charging. And so then in 18 to 22 months, even though they've been paying that card down, they've been using it. So they're not in any better position. So I would say it's a good strategy if you can be disciplined, right? And maybe just not use that card at all. Just use it for the balance transfer and divide the months by, the balance, and I have to pay this amount every month until it's paid off. So. There's a lot of good resources for paying down debt too out there. I know I've had some people go, I live in the Valley, I'm in the Appleton area, and sometimes I'll have people work with Goodwill. They have a whole financial division for people where you can meet with someone and they'll go over your finances and help you with a budget for people that are overwhelmed where they're facing like bankruptcy or what have you, right? They can talk to you about what your options are, and they even have Wisconsin has some unique debt pay down strategies that evade bankruptcy. So things like a zero interest 3-year payment plan where all your unsecured debt is rolled into the plan, things like that. So you won't know about it unless you talk to somebody that knows, some of this financial stuff. But it's a great resource, to meet with someone like a financial literacy coach that can help you kind of get on the right track if you're struggling with, you know, um, managing the day to day and leveraging a lot of debt. So So saving is different for everyone, right? But that old adage I think is important, which is to pay yourself first, right? Like it's easy to, to spend everything and have nothing left over. So think about that. You work hard for your money. Um, some of that should be set aside, right? Um, and then being creative. So looking for ways to reduce expenses, right? Um, it could be, holding off on buying that new car for a while, right? Like cars are lasting longer these days, right? Do we really need, if your car is just fine, do you really need that expensive car payment? It could be, getting on some type of a savings plan with your utilities, where you get a fixed amount every month as opposed to the surprises in the winter when it's cold. There's strategies to kind of make some of these expenses more predictable. Um, and then cutting things out, right? Like, um, I one time looked and I had a ton of subscriptions like Netflix and Hulu and um, Sling TV, and I had like all these subscriptions every month, and I don't even watch a ton of TV. And so, I got rid of some of those streaming services. So automating things is another important thing. Like if you can set up your paycheck where before you even see that money, 10%, whatever it is, 20%, whatever you can reasonably do, comes off the top and goes directly into a savings vehicle, right? So that's a really good way to out of sight, out of mind. Initially you'll feel the pain of, oh, my check feels a lot smaller because that money is going into savings, but after a while you'll kind of adjust to living on less. So a big one is, working with your partner too, for those of you that are in either married or living with someone or in a committed relationship. I see a lot of couples in couples counseling that have a lot of fights over money. Sometimes they keep separate bank accounts and, get upset when one partner spends without consulting the other. And so, I think I read somewhere that, a big percentage of divorce happens over financial issues. Um, so there's a lot to be said about working together as a team and talking about big purchases, right? Like um, if you're going to go out and spend whatever that amount is that you decide, right? Um, that we have a little discussion before we do that, or a cooling off period because maybe it's an impulse purchase, right? That type of thing. So it's a good idea to talk about this stuff. So it is not uncommon though for partners where, one of them is really disciplined about savings and is setting money aside for the future and, is trying to streamline things, and the other partner is, the spender that, rationalizes every purchase. So, you know, that might be an issue where if you've tried to work on it just by talking it out with your partner, that could be something you could talk about, even in a counseling session, the EAP. Um, People think of the EAP as things for like, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm having panic attacks, but it's really broader than that. We help people in couples counseling. We help people with finding resources. So let's just say you're the sandwich generation where you're raising your own children, but you have elderly parents where their health is starting to deteriorate. We can help you find resources to help with things like that. So um, even things like this, right? Because as I said, it's not just the dollars and cents of managing money. There's a lot of things that go into finances that are based on sheer emotion, right? So, that fear of missing out is one of them, right? So sometimes people have a partner that has a spending problem. I have come across this before in counseling, right? Where one of the partners, has a gambling problem or some type of addiction, and it's really creating, financial chaos for the family. So there are resources for that. I am an LPC and an addiction counselor. So I do meet with people that are in the throes of addictions. And addictions is not just addictions to drugs or alcohol. People have addictions to other things like gambling, pornography, shopping, right? There's actual addictions to substances, and then there are what we call process addictions, right? So people get addicted to lots of different things. So there's also a National Council on Problem Gambling. Um, but for some couples, right, if you're in a relationship where your spouse is, getting into big numbers with debt and stuff like that, it might be wise to, consult an attorney as to what can I do to protect myself, because as you know, in Wisconsin, we live in a marital property state. So what one partner takes on for debt is joint debt. So this is a topic about inflation. Right now, inflation is pretty high on those purchases that, we need day to day, like groceries. I know everybody talks about how expensive eggs are and things like that. So it is harder to budget today for things. That's the reality. So that might mean focusing on more of our needs and less of our wants, right? We might have to scale back a little bit on our wants and even looking for cheaper alternatives. I used to be a little bit of a snob about buying anything generic, like, oh, if I'm going to buy fruit, it's got to be Dole, or, if I'm going to buy, this, it's got to be made by this company because they're a better product. Well, after being educated about some of this stuff, I'm like, some of the same factories create the generic stuff. So thinking about things like that, looking for cheaper alternatives, buying in bulk. A lot of people have a Sam's Club or Costco membership for that. Um, I have a friend who we like to go to Costco, but like, who wants to spend, like I gotta buy, paper towels and I'm gonna spend 30 or $40 on paper towels in one fell swoop. So what we do is we take turns, one shopping one shopping outing, I buy all the paper towels and we split them in half. And then in another shopping outing, she buys all the paper towels and we split them in half and that type of thing. So being creative about some of this stuff, right? I remember growing up, my grandmother was really financially savvy, and Saturdays were spent like clipping coupons in the morning and going to three different grocery stores for the sale ads. Most people don't do that anymore, right? Time is more valuable to them, but there are ways to save by shopping the sales and things like that. So even considering things that are monthly expenses that are just, oh, this is a sunk cost. So I've had to do a little bit of flexible maneuvering with things like my internet and my cell phone bill, right? Like I was a Spectrum, I was paying like $100 a month for internet, and I knew people that were paying 30 or 40, and I'm like, why am I paying so much? And so I tried to get them to lower my bill and they wouldn't. So then I changed carriers. So sometimes it's, having to negotiate some of this stuff, or being creative with some of those expenses. Um, Looking into options at your bank for savings accounts that might earn a higher rate. Um, I think right now, for shorter term, there's kind of an inverted curve right now. So shorter term CDs are paying pretty well, things like that. So rather than sitting in a savings that's paying less than 1%, maybe locking up some of your money in something, like a CD that's under a year, that type of thing. Um, having the idea that you're not going to take on new debt if you can, right? Debt is a killer, right? That it just I think of debt as you're kind of enslaved to the debt company, right? Like you're working just to pay the interest and the principal on these cards and stuff. So I mean, it's there. Some people have to use credit. They can't make it without it, but um, try not to use it for things that, aren't absolute necessities. Some people are good with, using a credit card for, things where they get a lot of points and they use this as my travel card, and I get all these, I don't know, Hilton points or Sheridan points or whatever, and I travel in this chain and I pay off my card every month. If you're disciplined like that, fine, right? But more often than not, I see people carrying a balance on their credit cards from month to month. So, just wanted to throw it out there. I'm always eager to hear of good strategies for managing money during difficult times, right? Like right now, the market is kind of in a correction phase, right? It's hard to see your retirement dropping, right? Inflation is there with groceries and things like that. So, does anybody care to share any tips that they've used for budgeting and staying on track? Aaron, I thought I saw, I'm not looking at the chat, but I see like four in the chat. Was that anything?
That was just some requests for the values worksheet that you had shared on the
Okay.
screen. So I'll
Okay.
collect email addresses so we can send those out.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sounds good. So the other thing is to avoid the shame spiral, right? Like, and by shame, shame is an emotion that is toxic, right? So, you make a mistake, you feel guilty, you make amends, right? That's one thing. But some people really have this shame when it comes to finances, right? Like they're ashamed that they're in debt. You know, um, they avoid dealing with it because, I don't want to even see those statements because it just reminds me of how much I owe and I feel overwhelmed and things like that. And so sometimes people get caught up in this shame spiral and they kind of, stick their head in the sand because it's overwhelming and they feel bad when they look at this stuff. And I think that that is not uncommon, but it you know, for people that are struggling with that, working with, a financial coach or a financial advisor that you trust, right? Um, you can come to the EAP, right? And talk about some of those concerns, but just kind of sticking your head in the sand because when you open up the statements, you feel overwhelmed and you feel bad about being in debt, right? That's not going to make things better. That probably will make things worse. And actually, when people feel the shame of kind of being in debt and all that, you might think that they would change the path that they're on and stop spending and, really kind of buckle down. But what I've observed, at least, is that many people are caught up in that shame spiral, and it's like, oh, why even bother? I'm never gonna get ahead anyway, right? I'm just whatever. It is what it is. I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing, right? So we can help with some of that here too. Like I said, that some of you may be working with a financial coach, like if you have someone outside of your company, like an investment firm that's managing your money, even talking to them about that, right? Like yeah. There's so much, I believe, tied into finances. It's not all dollars and cents, right? There's a lot of emotional things that go into money, right? Um, some people have that scarcity mentality, right? Where there's never going to be enough. Some people, go out and spend money when they're feeling down because they get a feel good from it, right? Like I'm that person, right? I'd go to TJ Maxx and Marshalls and everybody knew me by name and it's like, yeah, I'm back for retail therapy. Um so at least I wasn't at Neiman Marcus, right? I was at TJ Maxx. But we get in those kinds of patterns, right? So really thinking about how our emotions play into how we manage our money. And if we can really start to align what we're doing with our values, right? We'll be a lot happier, right? Like it doesn't make us feel good when we see a credit card statement and we bought a bunch of junk that we really didn't care about or need, or, you know, toys that for the kids that ended up on the basement floor, that type of stuff, right? So really putting your money where your values are is a great strategy. So, as I leave you today, um, I'd like you to think about like one thing that you'll commit to for your financial wellness, right? Like, what is one thing that you think would really help you? And maybe it's having that conversation with a spouse to get on the same page. Maybe it's thinking about that ratio 50, 30, 20, and looking at where your money goes, right? Are you putting aside 20% or more? You know, there's a lot of money going out for debt, um, you know, things like that. So just think about one way that, sometimes some of this is baby steps, right? We can't make these huge changes overnight, but when you start working in that direction, motivation starts to kick in, you build momentum, things start to catch, right? So just starting on setting some of these financial goals is a win. So, okay. I wanted to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. No? Any questions, Aaron?
Nothing in the chat, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thank you guys for joining us today. As I said, this is recorded, so we have a website. Aaron, what's the website again with all our material?
Oh, yes. If you go to our EAP website, that would be EAP at ascension.org. And you can find all of our information there. This will be posted on our YouTube channel. You can find the link to that on our website, or you can go to YouTube and search Ascension Wisconsin EAP and find it.
Yeah. And there's some really great topics out there that we've recorded in the past that can be helpful to you. So I would encourage you to check that website out. The other thing too is if you decide you want to meet with a therapist, right, for whatever is going on in your life, and we've all got our thing, right? We all do, therapists included. So um, you can actually look at the biographies of the various therapists that work for Ascension's EAP and kind of pick one that's in line with what you think you need, right? We're all generalists here, but we all have a little different flavor of things that we kind of specialize in a little bit. So, right? So that helps to kind of just get a feel for people. So, yeah. So again, thank you all for showing up and participating, and I hope you got a couple nuggets of things that you can use. Um, I did hear that people would like some of those values inventories, and so I will um, I will send those out by email. So it's a good place to start is deciding, what your values are and developing your budget around those things. So